The first rule of surviving a man like Callum Russo is simple. Never show weakness. The second rule is never, ever keep him waiting. Sadie broke both rules on a freezing Tuesday night. She walked into his private booth at the Continental, apologizing for the delay, her voice trembling slightly. He was half a second from dismissing her entirely. Then she took a step into the lamplight. The ruthless head of the Chicago syndicate stopped. He saw the blood on her ruined shoe. He saw the limp. Time was the only currency Callum Russo actually respected. Money was infinite. Power was fluid. But time was a declining balance. He sat in the back booth of the Continental, a high-end steakhouse that existed mostly to wash his family's money, and stared at the gold hands of his Patek Philippe. 10 minutes past 9. The ice in his scotch had melted, diluting the amber liquid into something he no longer wanted to drink. Sadie Miller was 10 minutes late. Sadie wasn't a lieutenant. She wasn't a union boss, a corrupt alderman, or a rival capo. She was an art appraiser, a civilian. She spent her days covered in dust in the basement of a museum, and her nights authenticating stolen 18th century oils that Callum funneled through private auctions. She was quiet, aggressively competent, and usually 15 minutes early to everything. Callum tapped his heavy silver lighter against the mahogany table. A sharp, rhythmic thud. The sound made the waiter hovering near the pillar flinch. Callum didn't care. He was calculating the exact words he would use to sever Sadie's contract. Competence didn't buy a pass for disrespect. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant opened, letting in a gust of freezing Chicago rain and the muffled wail of a distant siren. Sadie walked in, Callum's jaw set. He watched her hand her dripping umbrella to the hostess. She looked a mess. Her usually neat trench coat was soaked dark at the shoulders, her hair plastered to her cheeks. She moved toward his booth, slowly, awkwardly. "Mr. Russo," she said. Her voice was steady, but thin, brittle. "I apologize. The red line was stalled. I had to walk the last 6 blocks in the storm." Callum didn't offer her a seat. He looked at her from under heavy, dark brows. She was shivering. The rainwater dripped from her chin onto the lapel of her coat. He looked for the lie in her face. The cynical part of him, the part that kept him alive, expected an excuse about a sick cat or a lost phone. But she just stood there, clutching her leather portfolio against her chest like a shield. "Sit," he said. A command, not an invitation. She moved to slide into the leather booth. That was when he saw it. She put her weight on her right leg, and her breath hitched. A sharp, involuntary intake of air. Her face went entirely pale. She practically fell into the leather seat, biting her lower lip so hard it turned white. Callum's eyes dropped beneath the table. Her left leg was extended awkwardly. Her sheer black tights were torn from the knee down, and her shoe, a sensible, low-heeled black pump, was scuffed. No, not just scuffed. The leather was torn, smeared with dark mud and something thicker, darker, and wet. Blood. Callum's annoyance vanished. It didn't evaporate into concern. It hardened into absolute, cold focus. His gaze snapped back up to her face. She was arranging her portfolio on the table, pretending her hands weren't shaking, pretending the air in the room hadn't just dropped 10 degrees. "I brought the provenance documents for the Caravaggio sketch," Sadie said, her voice a little too loud, a little too fast. "It's authentic. The The carbon dating on the paper matches the late 16th century. You'll have no problem at the auction house." Callum didn't look at the papers. He leaned forward. The leather of his chair creaked. "Why are you limping?" The question hung in the air, heavy and blunt. Sadie stopped shuffling the papers. She didn't look up. "I slipped. The rain on the platform." "Look at me." She hesitated. Then she raised her eyes. They were a dull, stormy gray, normally sharp with intelligence. Tonight they were clouded with exhaustion and a tight, suppressed panic. "You slipped," Callum repeated. His voice was entirely flat. "Yes." Callum reached across the table. He didn't grab her. He just placed his large, calloused hand flat over her shaking fingers, pinning them to the leather folder. Her skin was freezing. "Sadie," he said softly. The quietness of his tone was far more dangerous than if he had yelled. A slip on wet concrete bruises a knee. It scuffs the toe of a shoe. It doesn't tear the heel off. It doesn't leave defensive bruising on your wrists. Her eyes widened slightly. She tried to pull her hand back, but he held it firmly. He ran his thumb over her wrist. The skin there was already blooming into a violent, purplish-black ring, the exact shape of a heavy hand grabbing her, holding her in place. "Who did this?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "It was just a mugging. Please, Mr. Russo, can we just talk about the painting?" "No," Callum said. He let go of her hand and stood up. He threw a $100 bill onto the table to cover the untouched scotch. "We are leaving." "I haven't given you the report." "The report doesn't matter," Callum cut her off, stepping out of the booth. He looked down at her. She looked small, fragile, and utterly terrified. And for the first time in 10 years, Callum felt a surge of unadulterated, uncalculated rage. "Get up. If you can't walk, I will carry you out of here, and you do not want the kind of attention that will bring." Sadie clamped her mouth shut. She knew who he was. She knew what he did. She gripped the edge of the table and forced herself to her feet. She swayed. Callum didn't hesitate. He wrapped a heavy arm around her waist, pulling her against his side. She stiffened, letting out a small gasp of pain. He smelled rain, cheap vanilla soap, and the metallic tang of fear. "Walk," he murmured, his voice rumbling against her shoulder. "I've got you." The ride in the back of the Maybach was silent. Outside, the Chicago skyline blurred into smears of neon and rain through the tinted glass. Inside, the air was thick, smelling of rich leather and the damp wool of Sadie's coat. Callum sat opposite her, his elbows resting on his knees, watching her. Sadie was pressed into the furthest corner of the seat, staring out the window. She had her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was trying very hard not to exist. It was a survival tactic Callum recognized. He'd seen it in men facing down the barrel of a gun. He'd just never seen it in a woman who cataloged Renaissance art for a living. "Gabe," Callum said, not taking his eyes off Sadie. "Turn the heat up." "Yes, boss," the driver replied, tapping the console. A wave of dry, warm air flooded the cabin. Sadie didn't relax. "You don't have to do this," she said to the window. "I can just go home. My apartment is in Logan Square. It's on the way." "You aren't going to an empty apartment," Callum said. "Take off the coat." She turned her head, her brows drawing together in a defensive line. "Excuse me?" "The coat, Sadie. It's soaked. You're freezing, and it's doing you no favors. Take it off, or I will cut it off you." He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a statement of geographical fact. The sky is blue. Water is wet. I will use a knife to remove your clothing if you defy me." She hesitated, then fumbled with the buttons. Her fingers were stiff. Callum let out a slow breath, reached across the space between them, and batted her hands away. He unbuttoned the coat himself. He didn't linger. His movements were clinical, efficient. He pulled the heavy, wet fabric from her shoulders and tossed it onto the floorboard. Beneath it, she wore a simple white button-down and a dark gray wool skirt. The blouse was damp, clinging to her collarbones. "Now the shoe," he said. Sadie's jaw tightened. "I am fine." Callum leaned back into his seat. "If you are fine, then you won't mind me looking at it. Take off the shoe." With a trembling hand, she reached down and unbuckled the ruined pump. She slipped it off. She tried to hide her foot behind her other ankle, but Callum reached out and caught her calf. She flinched violently. Callum froze. He looked up at her face. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her breathing shallow and rapid. He realized what she thought. He was a monster in the dark, a mobster who killed people for sport. Of course she thought the worst. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was lower now, rougher. "I'm just going to look." He didn't wait for her permission. He guided her leg gently until her foot rested on the seat between them. The sheer black nylon was shredded. Beneath it, her ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin a mottled canvas of black, blue, and angry red. A jagged cut ran along her shin, still seeping sluggishly. Callum's thumb hovered over the swelling, not quite touching it. He recognized the injury. "This isn't a sprain," Callum said quietly. "Someone kicked you, hard, with a heavy boot." Sadie stared at her hands in her lap. She didn't speak. Callum looked closer at the cut. And that laceration wasn't from a fall. It was a blade, a shallow slice, deliberate. He raised his eyes. They were completely devoid of warmth. "A warning." Sadie let out a shaky breath. "They just wanted my bag. I told you. A mugger wants your wallet. They punch you, take the purse, and run. They don't take the time to hold you by the wrists, kick out your leg, and slice your shin to make a point." Callum leaned forward, invading her space. He forced her to meet his gaze. "Who did you talk to, Sadie?" "No one!" she snapped, a sudden spark of anger breaking through her fear. "I don't talk to anyone. I go to work. I go to my mother's nursing home. I do your appraisals, and I go home. I don't know anyone in your world." "Then why did they target you?" "I don't know," she cried out. The dam broke. A tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean line through the damp dirt on her face. She dashed it away angrily. "I was walking from the station, an alley by the bodega. 2 men stepped out. I offered them my purse. I told them to take it. But the big one, he laughed. He grabbed my arm." She touched her bruised wrist, swallowing hard. "Go on," Callum urged softly. "He said," she squeezed her eyes shut. "He said, tell the Roman that his assets are unprotected." Then he kicked my leg out from under me. I fell. The other one pulled a knife, cut my leg, took my portfolio bag, and they walked away. Callum sat perfectly still. The Roman. It was an old nickname, one he hadn't used since he was 22, rising through the ranks by leaving a trail of bodies in the South Side. Only one family still called him that. The O'Banians. The Irish syndicate he was currently trying to push out of the dockyards. They hadn't attacked a warehouse. They hadn't hit one of his men. They had found the quiet, invisible girl who authenticated his art, and they had brutalized her to send a message. They had brought her into the game. Callum looked down at her battered ankle. A strange, heavy sensation settled in his chest. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was something darker, something possessive. He had bought her time. He had paid for her expertise. She was his employee, under his protection, whether she knew it or not. "They took the portfolio?" he asked. Sadie nodded miserably. "Yes, I'm sorry. The original provenance papers were in there. I know you needed them for the auction on Thursday. I tried to hold on to it, but—" "Sadie," Callum interrupted. "Fuck the papers." She blinked at him, stunned. Callum pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket. He leaned over and gently, methodically, wrapped it around the bleeding cut on her shin. He tied it tight enough to stem the bleeding, but gentle enough not to cause her pain. His large hands were surprisingly dexterous. "Gabe," Callum called out to the front. "Yeah, boss." "We aren't going to the club. Take us to the penthouse. Call Dr. Evans. Tell him to meet us there in 20 minutes. Sadie panicked. "No, Mr. Russo, I don't need a doctor. I can go to a clinic tomorrow." Callum finished tying the knot and looked up at her. The cynical, calculated businessman was gone. The man looking at her now was a predator who had just found out someone was hunting in his territory. "You aren't going to a clinic," Callum said. "You aren't going to your apartment. You aren't going anywhere without 2 of my men standing outside your door until I say otherwise." "You can't do that. I'm not a part of this," she protested, her voice rising. Callum reached up and brushed a damp strand of hair off her cold cheek. The touch made her breath catch. "You are now," he said quietly. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a glass and steel tower overlooking Lake Michigan. It was a sterile, beautiful place. Floor-to-ceiling windows, slate floors, minimalist Italian furniture. It looked exactly like the man who owned it. Expensive, cold, and entirely unapproachable. Sadie felt completely out of place. Callum hadn't let her walk from the private elevator. The moment the doors chimed open, he had scooped her into his arms. She had gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his thick neck to steady herself. He smelled of expensive cologne, rain, and the faint, acrid scent of gunpowder. He carried her as easily as if she were made of paper, his face an unreadable mask, and deposited her onto a massive gray velvet sofa in the center of the living room. "Don't move," he commanded. He walked to a wet bar across the room and poured a measure of dark amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. He brought it back and pressed it into her hand. "Drink. It'll help with the shock." Sadie looked at the glass. Her hands were shaking so badly the liquid sloshed against the rim. She took a sip. It burned like fire going down, leaving a trail of intense heat in her chest. She coughed, but the shivering started to subside. "Thank you," she rasped. Callum pulled a leather ottoman closer to the sofa and sat down, facing her. He stripped off his suit jacket, tossing it over the back of a chair, and unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt, rolling them up over thick forearms corded with muscle and faded ink. "The doctor is 10 minutes out," Callum said, his eyes scanning her face. "Drink the rest of it." Sadie took another obedient sip. The alcohol was loosening the tight knot of terror in her stomach, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. She looked at the man sitting across from her. Callum Russo was 35, built like a heavyweight fighter, and had the eyes of a man who had seen the bottom of hell and decided to pave it. She had worked for him for 6 months. Their interactions had been strictly professional. Cold exchanges of paperwork for thick envelopes of cash. She had told herself it was fine. She was just doing a job. She wasn't holding the gun. She was just authenticating the paintings. Tonight, the illusion was shattered. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice sounded loud in the quiet cavern of the penthouse. Callum looked at her. "Doing what?" "Helping me, bringing me here." She gripped the glass tightly. "I'm a liability. They took the papers. They know I work for you. In your line of work, the standard procedure for a compromised asset isn't a penthouse and a private doctor. It's usually a shallow grave." A dark, humorless smile touched the corner of Callum's mouth. "You watch too many movies, Sadie." "I read the news," she shot back. "I know what happened to the union rep who talked to the feds last year." Callum leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The union rep was a thief who stole from my family. You are a civilian who got hurt because my enemies are cowards who can't hit me directly." He reached out and traced the line of her jaw with the back of his knuckles. It was a fleeting, impossibly gentle touch that sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. "They touched something of mine," Callum said softly. The possessive edge in his voice made her stomach flip. "They broke my toy. Now I have to break them." Sadie stiffened. "I'm not your toy. I'm an independent contractor." Callum actually let out a low bark of laughter. It was a harsh, scraping sound. "An independent contractor. Right. Is that what you told yourself when you deposited those cash envelopes into the Cayman account I set up for you?" Her cheeks flushed hot. "I needed the money for my mother's care. I don't care why you took the money, Sadie. I care that you did." His gaze dropped to her mouth, lingering for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. "You stepped into the dark. You can't be surprised when the monsters bite." Before she could form a retort, the private elevator chimed. A silver-haired man carrying a black leather medical bag stepped out. "Dr. Evans!" He didn't look around the penthouse. He didn't look at Callum with anything other than polite deference. He was a man paid to fix bullet holes and broken bones with 0 questions asked. "Callum," the doctor nodded. "Doc, it's her right leg. Ankle is swollen, likely a severe sprain or a hairline fracture. Laceration on the shin needs cleaning and maybe stitches. Check her wrists for contusions." Callum delivered the medical assessment with cold, clinical precision. He stood up, giving the doctor room. Dr. Evans moved in, opening his bag. "Hello, miss. Let's take a look." For the next 20 minutes, Callum stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering grid of Chicago. But his reflection in the glass showed he was watching them. He watched the doctor probe her ankle. He watched Sadie bite her lip to keep from crying out. He watched the blood being wiped away from her pale skin. Every flinch she made was a match struck in the dark room of his temper. "No fracture," Dr. Evans finally announced, taping a neat white bandage over her shin. "A severe bone bruise and a grade 2 sprain of the ankle ligaments. She needs ice, elevation, and absolutely no weight bearing for at least a week. The cut didn't require stitches, but I've applied steri strips. I'll leave a prescription for antibiotics and a strong anti-inflammatory." "Leave the meds. She's staying here," Callum said, without turning from the window. Sadie's head snapped up. "I can't stay here. I have to go to the museum tomorrow. I have a backlog." "You are going nowhere," Callum interrupted, finally turning around. He walked over to the doctor, handed him a thick envelope of cash from an inside pocket, and walked him to the elevator. When the doors closed, leaving them alone again, the silence rushed back in. Sadie swung her good leg off the sofa. "Mr. Russo, Callum, be reasonable. I appreciate the medical attention, but I am not your prisoner. I'm leaving." She tried to stand, putting weight on her left foot and hopping. She made it exactly one step before her injured ankle clipped the edge of the coffee table. The pain was blinding. Her leg buckled. She braced for the hard impact of the slate floor. It never came. Callum was there. He caught her by the waist, his arm an iron band pulling her flush against his chest. The impact knocked the breath out of her. For a moment, they were frozen. Her hands were flat against the hard planes of his chest. She could feel the steady, heavy thud of his heartbeat beneath his shirt. He was staring down at her, his face inches from hers. His eyes, usually dark and empty, were burning. "I am a very reasonable man," Callum murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He didn't let her go. He held her tighter. "But right now, Sadie, I am holding on to my sanity by a very thin thread. The men who did this to you are dead. They just don't know it yet. Until they are, you are staying exactly where I can see you." Sadie looked up into his eyes, her breath mingling with his. She realized then, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that she wasn't afraid of the O'Banions. She was afraid of the fact that she didn't want him to let go. The guest bedroom did not look like a place where anyone actually slept. It was too clean. The lines of the platform bed were sharp, the charcoal-colored linens pulled so tight they looked painted on. A single heavy glass carafe of water sat on the nightstand next to a bottle of prescription pills the doctor had left behind. Callum set Sadie down on the edge of the mattress. His hands lingered on her waist for a beat too long, the heat of his palms pressing through her damp cotton blouse, before he pulled away and stood up. He looked out of place in the bedroom, a large, violent man framed by soft lighting and expensive linen. "You need to change," he said, his eyes scanning her shivering frame. "I'll have Gabe fetch some of your clothes from your apartment tomorrow. For tonight, there's a drawer in the closet. Use what's in there." Sadie gripped the edge of the mattress. Her fingers sank into the expensive fabric. "What is in there?" "Sweaters, shirts, things left behind by people who didn't stay." His voice was indifferent, but the implication was clear. She wasn't the first person he had kept in his orbit, though she suspected she was the first one he had brought here under these circumstances. "I don't want to wear some other woman's clothes, Callum," she said, using his first name again. It felt dangerous, like stepping onto thin ice, but the formality of Mr. Russo felt absurd now that she was sitting on his bed with a bandaged leg. Callum looked at her, his expression hardening. "They aren't women's clothes. They're mine, brand new. I don't like running out of clean shirts when I work late." He walked to the door, his hand resting on the heavy brass handle. "Change. The bathroom has heated floors. Use them." He closed the door behind him with a soft, decisive click. The silence of the room rushed in to fill the space he left behind. Sadie sat still for a long minute, listening to the quiet hum of the building's climate control. Her ankle throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that seemed to match the beating of her heart. Slowly, carefully, she slid off the bed, keeping her weight entirely on her left leg, and hopped toward the closet. The closet was larger than her entire kitchen in Logan Square. Inside, hanging in neat color-coded rows, were dozens of identical charcoal, black, and navy suits. On the shelves below sat stacks of folded black t-shirts and heavy gray cashmere sweaters. She pulled down a gray sweater. It was massive, smelling faintly of cedar and the clean, dry scent of the high-end department store it had come from. In the bathroom, she washed her face. The mirror showed a girl she barely recognized, pale, hollow-eyed, with a thin streak of dried blood along her collarbone that she hadn't noticed before. She wiped it away with a thick white washcloth, watching the crimson stain bloom in the fibers before disappearing down the drain. She pulled the heavy sweater over her head. It swallowed her, the hem falling past her thighs, the sleeves pooling around her knuckles. It was warm. Sweeter than the warmth was the sheer weight of the fabric. It felt like a suit of armor. When she hopped back into the bedroom, she heard the low rumble of Callum's voice through the door. He was in the main living space, speaking to someone. Sadie crept to the door, pressing her ear against the cool wood. "I don't care what meeting he's in," Callum was saying. His voice was low, but it had a vibration that traveled through the floorboards. "You find Declan O'Banion. You tell him that if his boys are going to play in my yard, they better be prepared to lose their hands. No negotiations, no sit-downs. They took something of mine, Gabe. I want it back tonight, and I want the men who took it." A pause. Then, the sound of glass clinking. "Yeah, the papers too," Callum said. "But mostly, I want the hands." Sadie felt a cold sweat break out on her neck. The hands. He wasn't talking about a metaphor. He was talking about the physical, blood-soaked reality of the world he lived in. A world she had tried to pretend she was only observing through a microscope, like a bug in amber. She turned away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, and crawled back into the massive bed. She pulled the heavy duvet up to her chin. The cashmere sweater kept her warm, but she couldn't stop shaking. Hours passed. The city outside the glass tower grew quiet, the rain tapering off into a gray, freezing mist. Sadie drifted in and out of a shallow, uneasy sleep, haunted by the sound of footsteps in wet alleys and the cold slide of metal against her skin. Every time she woke, she looked at the thin sliver of light beneath the bedroom door. Callum was still out there. She could hear the occasional murmur of his phone, the heavy tread of his boots on the slate floor. He was a sentinel in his own home, a beast pacing the perimeter of his cage, waiting for the dark to break. The sun didn't rise so much as the sky simply turned the color of dirty slush. Sadie woke to the smell of coffee, strong, dark, and rich. Her body felt heavy, her muscles sore from the tension of the previous night. She sat up, her ankle protesting with a sharp, hot needle of pain that made her groan. She managed to hop her way out of the bedroom, using the wall for support. The penthouse was flooded with the flat, gray morning light. Callum was sitting at the kitchen island, a laptop open in front of him. He had changed his shirt. He wore a clean black long sleeve, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. A white ceramic mug sat near his hand, steam rising from the dark liquid inside. He didn't look up when she entered, but he spoke as if he had been watching her the whole time. "You're moving too much. The doctor said no wait." "I have to use the bathroom, Callum. I can't hover across the floor," Sadie said, her voice dry. He closed the laptop with a quiet snap. He stood up, walked over to her, and before she could protest, he lifted her again. He did it with a casual, practiced ease that made her feel incredibly small. He carried her to the kitchen island and set her down on one of the high leather bar stools, adjusting her injured leg so it rested comfortably on an adjacent stool. "Eat," he said, gesturing to a plate of dry toast and poached eggs that sat on the counter. "I'm not hungry. You lost blood. You're in shock. Eat the eggs, Sadie, or I'll feed them to you myself." She looked at him, searching for some sign of a joke, but his face was a dead end. His features were heavy, carved from some hard, unforgiving stone. She picked up the fork and took a bite. The food was warm, and to her surprise, her stomach instantly clamored for more. She ate in silence while Callum watched her, his fingers tapping a slow, irregular rhythm against his coffee mug. That was when she noticed his right hand. The knuckles were swollen, the skin split across 3 of them, the edges raw and crusted with dark, dried blood. A thick bruise was already forming across the back of his hand, reaching up toward his wrist. Sadie stopped eating. She stared at his hand. "What happened?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Callum looked down at his knuckles, as if he had forgotten they were there. He flexed his fingers, a small wince tightening the corners of his eyes. "I had a conversation with Declan's people. The ones who—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "They won't be using those hands to hold a knife again," Callum said flatly. He picked up his coffee, taking a slow sip. "And they won't be kicking anyone either." The cold reality of it settled over the kitchen. Sadie looked at the eggs on her plate, suddenly feeling sick. "Did you kill them? Does it matter?" "Yes," she said, her voice rising, cracking with the strain of the last 12 hours. "Of course it matters. I am an art historian, Callum. I write essays on brushstrokes and provenance. I don't want people dead because of me." "They didn't die because of you," Callum said, his voice dropping into a register that was terrifyingly calm. He leaned across the counter, his shadow falling over her. "They died because they forgot who runs this city. They died because they thought they could use a woman to get to me and have me sit at a table to negotiate. They made a calculation, and they got the math wrong." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, dark leather object. He tossed it onto the counter. It was her portfolio bag. The leather was stained with water, the strap half torn, but it was there. Sadie reached out, her fingers trembling as she unzipped the main compartment. Inside, the thick, cream-colored sheets of the Caravaggio provenance documents were dry, untouched by the rain or the blood. She looked from the papers to Callum's split knuckles. "You went back for this," she said. It wasn't a question. "You said you needed them for the auction," Callum replied. He stood up, turning his back to her as he walked to the sink to rinse his mug. "The Russo family doesn't lose assets. We don't lose paperwork, and we don't let people take what belongs to us. Belongs to us." She wasn't sure if he meant the papers or her. The line between the two felt incredibly thin. Sadie slid off the stool, ignoring the flare of pain in her ankle, and hopped toward the sink. She grabbed his arm, her small fingers wrapping around his thick wrist. He froze, his shoulder muscles tightening under the black fabric of his shirt. "Let me," she said softly. He didn't move. He didn't turn around. "Let you what?" "Your hand. It's dirty. It's going to get infected." Callum turned slowly. He looked down at her, his eyes dark, searching her face for the fear that usually defined how people looked at him. But she wasn't looking at him with fear. She was looking at him with a strange, quiet grief. "I've had worse," he said, I'm sure you have, Sadie replied. She reached for the small first aid kit Dr. Evans had left on the side counter. She pulled out a bottle of antiseptic and a box of clean gauze. Sit down. For a second, she thought he would refuse. He was Callum Russo. He didn't take orders from girls who spent their lives in library basements. But then, with a slow, heavy sigh, he sat on the bar stool she had just vacated. She stood between his knees, her good leg supporting her weight, her bad foot resting lightly on the rungs of the stool. She poured the antiseptic onto a piece of gauze. This is going to sting, she warned. I'm aware. She pressed the wet gauze to his split knuckles. Callum didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just stared at her face, his gaze tracing the small curve of her nose, the pale skin of her forehead, the way her lower lip was bitten raw from her own pain. You're very quiet, he murmured. I'm trying to concentrate, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She wiped away the dried blood, revealing the jagged splits in the skin. You have terrible hands, Callum. They're too big, too hard. They do the job. Your job is horrible. It's the only one I have, he said. Sadie looked up from his hand, her gray eyes meeting his dark ones. The distance between them was gone. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, could see the tiny silver scar near his temple, the roughness of his jaw. She realized then that this was the trap. The danger wasn't just the O'Banions. The danger was that this man, with his bloody knuckles and his cold penthouse, was the only thing making her feel safe in a world that had suddenly gone mad. She pressed a fresh bandage over his knuckles, her fingers lingering against his palm. His hand closed around hers, slowly, firmly, trapping her fingers in his grip. He didn't squeeze, but the message was clear. You're in the dark now, his eyes told her, and I am the only light you have left. By Wednesday afternoon, Sadie stopped trying to pretend she wasn't a hostage. The penthouse was a gilded cage, suspended 50 stories above a city that was currently tearing itself apart, looking for the men Callum Russo had broken. She knew this not because Callum told her, but because she watched the local news on the massive flat screen in the living room. 2 bodies pulled from the Chicago River. Unidentified, but the anchor mentioned severe trauma to the hands and face. Sadie had muted the television and stared at the dark screen for an hour. She was allowed to walk, but only with a heavy orthopedic boot Dr. Evans had sent up, and only for short distances. She spent most of her time on the charcoal sofa, wrapped in Callum's oversized sweater, watching the rain batter the glass. Callum was a ghost in his own home. He left before dawn, the heavy deadbolt clicking into place behind him, and returned long after dark. When he was there, he was always on the phone. His voice was a low, constant rumble from the home office down the hall, discussing shipping manifests, port authority bribes, and violence with the same detached, clinical tone. On Thursday morning, the silence broke. Sadie was standing at the kitchen island, shifting her weight awkwardly to make a cup of tea when the front door opened. Callum walked in. He looked exhausted. The sharp lines of his face were drawn tight, and a dark shadow of stubble covered his jaw. He tossed a heavy leather briefcase onto the slate floor and shrugged out of his overcoat. He didn't look at her as he walked straight to the wet bar and poured 2 fingers of bourbon. It was 10 in the morning. I need to leave today, Sadie said. Callum stopped with the glass halfway to his mouth. He took a slow swallow, set the glass down, and finally turned to look at her. No. It's Thursday, she pressed, her knuckles turning white around her ceramic mug. I visit my mother at the Hawthorne Care Facility every Thursday. If I don't show up, she gets agitated. The staff won't know how to calm her down. The staff at Hawthorne are currently very well compensated to ensure your mother is perfectly calm, Callum said flatly. Sadie froze. What did you do? Callum walked across the kitchen, stopping on the opposite side of the marble island. He pulled a folded sheet of heavy stock paper from his suit pocket and slid it across the smooth surface. Sadie hesitated, then picked it up. It was a receipt from the Hawthorne Care Facility. It showed a zero balance. Beneath it was a line item for a private 24-hour registered nurse, paid in full for the next 5 years. You didn't, she breathed, her stomach plummeting. I did, Callum replied, his eyes locked on her face. There are currently 2 men sitting in an unmarked sedan across the street from the facility. The director thinks they are private security hired by an anonymous benefactor. Your mother is fine. She is safe. She is a civilian, Callum. She has Alzheimer's. You can't just buy my family's life. Sadie slammed the paper onto the counter. The anger she had been suppressing for 3 days finally cracked through the terror. She wasn't an employee anymore. She was property. He was managing her life the way he managed his warehouses and his offshore accounts. Callum didn't flinch at her outburst. He simply leaned forward, placing his large hands flat on the marble. The O'Banions know who you are, Sadie, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Declan O'Banion is a cornered animal. He lost his dockyard contract, he lost 2 of his enforcers, and he knows I am bleeding his supply lines dry. If you walk out that door, you don't just put a target on your own back. You put one on your mother's. So what? She shot back, tears of absolute frustration stinging her eyes. I just stay here? Forever? I eat your food and wear your clothes while you fight a war outside? I have a job. I have a life. Your life is on pause. Who gave you the right to decide that? The men who cut your leg open, Callum roared. The sound shattered the quiet of the penthouse. Sadie flinched, stepping back, her bad ankle screaming in protest. She gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. Callum saw her flinch. The anger drained from his face instantly, replaced by a dark, heavy mask of control. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, took a slow breath, and walked around the island. He stopped inches from her. He was so close she could smell the bourbon, the rain, and the metallic tang of dried blood that seemed to cling to him permanently. I am not keeping you here to punish you, Sadie, he said quietly. I am keeping you here because if anything happens to you, I will burn this entire city to the ground, and I don't have the time to deal with the ashes. He reached out. For a second, Sadie thought he was going to touch her cheek. Instead, his hand dropped to the collar of the oversized sweater she wore. He adjusted it slightly, his rough knuckles brushing briefly against her collarbone. The touch sent a violent shiver down her spine. There's a dress in the guest room closet, he said, stepping back. It was delivered this morning. Put it on. We are leaving at 8 tonight. Leaving? To go where? Callum turned toward the hallway. To the auction. You authenticated the Caravaggio. Now you're going to help me sell it. The dress was armor. It was emerald green silk, cut with a high neck and long sleeves, but it clung to every curve of her body like water. It swept the floor, completely concealing the heavy medical boot she wore on her right foot. When Sadie looked in the mirror, she didn't see the quiet art historian who wore sensible cardigans and took the red line to work. She saw a woman who belonged to the underworld. She applied dark red lipstick with shaking hands. When she limped out into the living room, Callum was waiting. He wore a bespoke black tuxedo that fit perfectly across his broad shoulders. He looked like old money. He looked like old violence. He turned around as he heard her approach, and the breath actually hitched in his chest. He covered it instantly, his expression hardening into professional approval. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I can walk," she said. She leaned slightly on a sleek black carbon fiber cane Dr. Evans had dropped off earlier that afternoon. "I just can't run." "You won't need to," Callum said. He held out his arm. "Hold on to me." The auction was held in the private gallery of the Continental Art Society, a limestone fortress in the Gold Coast neighborhood. The room was packed with the city's elite. Bankers, tech billionaires, and politicians mingled with men like Callum, men who wore expensive suits to hide the blood on their hands. The air smelled of expensive champagne, rare orchids, and quiet corruption. The moment Callum entered with Sadie on his arm, the room fell silent. He never brought dates to business events, let alone a woman with a cane and sharp gray eyes. "Keep your head up," he murmured. "Smile. Let them see you." "Why are we doing this?" Sadie asked quietly. "Because people think I'm weak," Callum replied. "They believe someone touched what was mine, and I hid the damage. I don't hide." They reached the center of the room, standing near a roped-off alcove where the Caravaggio sketch was displayed under museum-grade lighting. Sadie felt the heavy weight of the crowd's attention, but the only gaze that actually mattered came from a man standing by the bar. Declan O'Banion. He was in his late 50s, with thinning reddish hair and a face deeply lined by whiskey and stress. The moment he saw Callum, his eyes dropped to Sadie, specifically to the cane in her hand. A small, ugly smile touched the corners of his mouth. He set his drink down and began walking toward them. Callum felt Sadie stiffen against his arm. He placed his free hand over hers, holding her firmly in place. "Don't move. Don't speak unless I tell you to." Declan stopped 3 feet away. He didn't look at Callum right away. He kept his eyes fixed on Sadie. "Evening, Callum," Declan said. His voice was a raspy Chicago brogue. "I see you brought a +1, and here I thought you were strictly business." He tilted his head at Sadie. "Looks like she had a rough week. Nasty slip on the ice?" Callum didn't smile. His eyes were dead black, void of any human warmth. "She's recovering nicely. The men who caused the slip, however, won't be recovering at all. I heard they had a swimming accident near Navy Pier." Declan's ugly smile vanished. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The 2 bodies in the river. "The river is treacherous this time of year," Declan said tightly. "It is," Callum agreed. "Especially for bottom feeders." The air between the 2 men was practically vibrating with violence. It was a physical weight pressing against Sadie's chest. Declan finally dragged his eyes away from Callum and looked at the Caravaggio sketch behind them. "Nice piece of paper," Declan sneered. "I heard a rumor you lost the provenance documents for it. Careless. Makes a man wonder if the thing is even real, or just a clever forgery you're trying to fence to pay for your dockyard losses." He was testing the waters, trying to see if his men had actually succeeded in destroying the papers before Callum killed them. Callum opened his mouth to reply, but Sadie beat him to it. "It's an authentic late 16th century piece," she said. Her voice rang out, clear and steady, cutting through the low hum of the ballroom. Both men snapped their attention to her. Callum's grip on her arm tightened in a silent warning, but Sadie ignored it. She unlinked her arm from his, stepping forward slightly, leaning her weight onto the cane. She looked Declan O'Banion directly in the eye. "The ink is an iron gall composition consistent with Roman workshops in 1599, Sadie continued, slipping effortlessly into the academic authority she used to command boardrooms. "The paper bears the watermark of a Fabriano mill that burned down in 1601. Furthermore, the cross-hatching on the shadow of the clavicle is a distinct signature of the artist's manic, unrefined study phase." She offered Declan a cold, empty smile. "The provenance documents are locked in Mr. Russo's private vault. They are fully intact, but even without them, a child could see the authenticity of the stroke work. Unless, of course, you lack the education to recognize it, Mr. O'Banion." Complete silence fell over their small circle. Declan's face turned a mottled shade of red. He had expected a terrified victim, a trembling girl he could use to mock his rival. Instead, he had just been publicly dressed down by her. He took a half step forward, his fists clenching. "You arrogant little—" Callum moved. It wasn't a large movement, just a subtle shift of his shoulders, planting his body squarely between Sadie and the older mob boss. But the lethal intent radiating from him was so intense it physically pushed Declan back a step. "Finish that sentence, Declan," Callum whispered. His voice was barely audible, a promise of absolute butchery. "I dare you." Declan looked at the cold, predatory anticipation in Callum's eyes. He realized he had miscalculated again. He swallowed hard, adjusted his cuffs, and took a step back. "Enjoy the auction, Callum," Declan spat. He turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Callum stood still for a long moment, his chest rising and falling slowly as the adrenaline leveled out in his blood. He turned to Sadie. She was gripping the handle of her cane so hard her fingers were bone white. The academic facade had cracked. She looked like she might faint. Callum reached out, wrapping his large hand around her waist, pulling her weight against his side. "I told you not to speak," he said, his voice a low, rough scrape. "He was insulting your asset," Sadie said, her breath shuddering as she leaned into him. "I was just protecting my work." Callum looked down at her, his eyes tracing the fierce, terrified defiance in her face. A slow, dark smile finally broke across his face. Not the cynical smirk he gave his enemies, but something genuinely, dangerously possessive. "You didn't just protect your work, Sadie," he murmured, his thumb brushing over the silk at her waist. "You just declared war." The ride back to the penthouse was silent. Beyond the Maybach's tinted windows, Chicago's lights blurred across the night. Inside, Sadie rested her head against the cool glass. The adrenaline that had carried her through the gala was gone, replaced by deep exhaustion as pain pulsed through her injured leg. Callum sat across from her without a word, watching quietly. When they reached the underground garage, Gabe opened the door. Callum stepped out, then lifted Sadie into his arms before she could reach for her cane. This time, she didn't resist. She rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in his cologne and the faint scent of cigar smoke from the auction. The private elevator ride up was quiet, save for the soft ping of the passing floors. 50 stories. A vertical ascent away from the real world. The doors opened into the penthouse. Callum carried her to the charcoal velvet sofa and set her down with terrifying care. He took her cane and laid it on the glass coffee table. Then He walked to the wet bar, poured 2 fingers of Lagavulin, and downed it in a single, sharp swallow. He poured a second glass and walked back to her. He didn't hand it to her. He set it on the table and stood over her, his hands buried in the pockets of his tuxedo trousers. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but the timbre of it rattled the ice in the glass. Sadie looked up at him. She didn't shrink back. "I authenticated a painting." "You humiliated a man who murders people over parking spaces," Callum corrected, his jaw tight. "Declan was trying to provoke me. He wanted me to swing first in front of the aldermen and half the city's major donors. I had it under control, and then you decided to play soldier." "I wasn't playing anything," she shot back, her hands gripping the thick emerald silk of her dress. "He was looking at me like I was a broken toy. He was looking at my leg like it was a punchline. I was tired of being the punchline, Callum. I'm tired of being afraid of these men." "You should be afraid of them," Callum barked, his control finally slipping. He pulled his hands from his pockets and leaned down, bracing his arms on the back of the sofa, trapping her between his chest and the upholstery. "They aren't museum curators, Sadie. They don't care about your intellect. They only care about what breaks easiest. And you just painted a massive glowing target on your own back to defend my pride." "It wasn't your pride," Sadie yelled back, her gray eyes flashing with raw, untempered fury. "It was mine. I am the one who got dragged into an alley. I am the one who was bleeding on the concrete. You don't get to own my anger. It belongs to me." Callum froze. He stared at her, breathing heavily. The space between them evaporated. He saw the fire in her eyes, the flush of color high on her pale cheeks, the rigid set of her shoulders. She wasn't a civilian anymore. The brutality of his world hadn't crushed her. It had forged her into something sharp, something lethal. "You little fool," he whispered, the anger draining from his voice, replaced by a dark, agonizing gravity. Callum dropped his hands from the sofa. He reached out, his thick, scarred fingers sliding into the hair at the nape of her neck. He pulled her forward. His mouth crashed down on hers. There was no hesitation, no gentle preamble. It was a collision of relief, rage, and a possession so deep it felt like violence. Sadie gasped into his mouth, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his tuxedo. He tasted like expensive scotch and the copper tang of adrenaline. She kissed him back with the exact same desperation, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer until there was absolutely no air left between them. Callum groaned, a low guttural sound in the back of his throat. He shifted his weight, his knee pressing into the cushions beside her, his large hands dropping to her waist. He hauled her up against his chest, careful of her bad leg, lifting her so she was flush against the hard lines of his body. It was a kiss that burned bridges, a kiss that told her, without a single word, that the line between employer and asset was completely, irrevocably erased. Suddenly, the harsh buzz of a cell phone shattered the quiet. Callum tore his mouth away, his breathing ragged. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. The phone buzzed again, a relentless vibration from his jacket pocket. He let out a long, heavy exhale and pulled back. He didn't look at his phone. He looked at Sadie. Her lips were swollen, her eyes wide and dark. "Callum," she breathed. He finally pulled the phone from his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth vanished from his face, replaced by the dead, icy mask of the Roman. He answered it, putting it to his ear. "Speak." Sadie watched him listen. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables. "How many?" Callum asked quietly. "Fine. Lock down the southern ports. I'm on my way." He hung up. He looked down at the phone for a second before slipping it back into his pocket. He turned to Sadie. The man who had just kissed her was gone. The executioner was back. "Declan just hit my warehouse in Pilsen," Callum said flatly. "He couldn't take the hit to his ego at the auction. He panicked. He sent 2 crews with automatic weapons. 3 of my men are dead." Sadie's blood ran cold. "Because of what I said." "No," Callum said sharply. He stepped forward, grabbing her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Because he is a dead man who doesn't know how to lie down yet. This was always going to happen. You just accelerated the timeline." He let her go and walked toward the heavy oak door by the foyer. He pulled a black, steel-heavy Glock from a lockbox on the console table and shoved it into the holster at the small of his back. He didn't put his suit jacket back on. "Callum!" Sadie called out, panic finally breaking through her resolve. He stopped with his hand on the doorknob. He looked back at her. The penthouse was suddenly too large, too quiet. "Don't leave," she said, her voice shaking. "I have to," he replied. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "What if you don't come back?" A small, grim smile touched his mouth. "I always come back." The door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place. Sadie was alone in the dark. The clock on the wall read 4:17 a.m. Sadie sat on the slate floor of the bathroom, her back pressed against the cold edge of the bathtub, her bad leg stretched out in front of her. She hadn't slept. She had listened to the rain turn to sleet against the windows. She had listened to the sirens wailing in the distance, wondering if they were screaming for him. At 5 a.m., the heavy metallic slide of the deadbolt echoed through the penthouse. Sadie scrambled to her feet, grabbing her cane. She limped down the hallway into the main living space. Callum was standing by the kitchen island. He looked like he had been dragged through hell. His white dress shirt was ruined, torn at the shoulder, and smeared with dark, drying blood that wasn't his. His knuckles were busted open again, fresh red dripping sluggishly onto the marble counter. He was leaning heavily against the island, staring blankly at the floor. "Callum," she whispered. His head snapped up. His eyes were entirely black, dilated with violence and exhaustion. When he saw her, standing there in the wrinkled emerald dress, gripping her cane, the tension drained out of him all at once. He didn't say anything. He just held his arms open. Sadie dropped the cane. She hobbled the last 5 feet, throwing her arms around his neck. Callum caught her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his massive frame shaking slightly. He smelled of cordite, blood, and freezing rain. It was the scent of a nightmare, but to Sadie, it was the only thing that mattered. He was alive. "It's over," he grated against her skin, his voice utterly hoarse. "Declan is gone. His lieutenant surrendered the territory. It's done." He pulled back, his hands resting on her waist. He looked at her face, studying it as if memorizing the details. Then he stepped away. The distance between them was physical, but it felt miles wide. Callum walked to the wet bar, grabbed a towel, and wiped the blood off his hands. He tossed the stained rag into the sink, Gabe is downstairs with the car, Callum said. He didn't look at her. He stared out the window at the gray, bruised sky of the Chicago dawn. Your apartment has been secured. The nursing home is paid through the next decade. There is $2 million in a blind trust in your name. You can walk out that door right now, Sadie. You go back to your museum. You go back to your quiet life. And you never see me again. Sadie stood frozen. The offer hung in the air, heavy and absolute. It was the out. It was her salvation. She could take the money, take her sensible shoes, and disappear back into the crowd. She could pretend the last week was just a terrible, bloody dream. Is that what you want? She asked quietly. Callum gripped the edge of the marble counter so hard his knuckles turned white. He finally turned to look at her. The devastation in his eyes was absolute. It's what you deserve, he said, his voice breaking. Look at me, Sadie. I am a butcher. I will always be a butcher. You are a civilian. If you stay here, there is no going back. The blood doesn't wash off. You will live in the dark with me for the rest of your life. Sadie looked at the blood on his shirt. She looked at the city below them, slowly waking up, completely ignorant of the war that had just been fought in its shadows. She looked at the man who had bought her mother's safety, the man who had torn a city apart because someone scuffed her knee. She walked over to the coffee table. She picked up the heavy crystal glass he had poured the night before, still sitting there, the ice long melted. She walked to the sink and poured the watered-down scotch down the drain. I don't like my apartment, Sadie said. Her voice was perfectly steady. It's cold and the radiator makes a terrible noise. Callum watched her, his breath catching in his throat. Sadie, I don't want a quiet life, Callum. She walked toward him, ignoring the ache in her leg. She stopped directly in front of him, reaching out to gently trace the fresh cuts on his knuckles. A quiet life didn't protect me. You did. She looked up into his dark, ruined eyes. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. The girl who rode the red line was dead, left behind in an alley in the rain. You said I belonged to you, Sadie murmured, her hand sliding up his chest to rest over his heart. It was beating violently against her palm. So keep me. Callum let out a ragged, desperate breath. He wrapped his arms around her, crushing her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. He knew he was damning her. He knew he was pulling an angel down into the mud. But as she wrapped her arms around his neck and held him back, he knew he would slaughter half the world before he ever let her go. The city outside the glass woke up to the gray morning, oblivious to the fact that the Roman had just won the war. But inside the penthouse, the real surrender had just begun. And that is the end of Sadie and Callum's story. Sometimes the knight in shining armor is actually the villain covered in blood. And sometimes that's exactly what the heroine needs to survive. Did Sadie make the right choice by staying in the dark, or should she have taken the money and run? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this dark, gritty romance and want to hear more stories where the bad guy falls first and falls hardest, hit that like button, share this video, and make sure to subscribe. See you next time.